Hi everyone, welcome again to a unit from the course Business Ethics and Corporate Social Responsibility. Today we are going to have a brief overview of some ethical problems in business. First, we are going to explain what is an ethical problem. Then we introduce two related issues, corruption and conflict of interest. And finally, we will talk about solutions, how to manage human rights violations. An ethical problem is a situation, a set of facts or circumstances that have to do with human action in spaces of freedom and with the consequences in the lives of other people. Most of the problems we face daily are complex and have multiple dimensions: technical, economical, political, legal, ethical, and so on. Although usually one of these dimensions prevails over the others, depending on the situation and the specific problem. The reality is that in all problems there are multiple dimensions. Thus, the ethical approach is a dimension of reality, a perspective or a way of looking reality that is present in the problems we face and that on many occasions we are not able to perceive it, but it is there. To recognize the ethical dimension, we can help of this characteristic. First, they require the use of human freedom. When we face with a problem and there are no options or we don't have any possibility of actions, we cannot speak of an ethical problem. Second, ethics always places people at the center and also the consequences that affect them. Third, an ethical solution has to be realistic in the sense that is possible and achievable. And fourth, an ethical problems must be resolved by the protagonist. No one should make ethical decisions for me. So let's see. One of the biggest ethical problems in the world is corruption. Corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. It hurts everyone who depends on the integrity of the people in a position of authority. Not illegal behavior is corruption, and not all corrupt behavior is illegal. Corruption involves the misuse of one's position for personal gain at the expenses of others. Corruption is not only a question of personal greed, but it is also an organizational and social question. There are some factors that affect corruption. For example, inappropriate government infrastructure, that is, power concentration without accountability and malfunction of the democracy. Another factor is information deficit, lack of transparency and accountability, lack of freedom of expression and press freedom, lack of accountability and proper financial management. We also can identify that opportunities and incentives are relevant to produce corruption. For example, high investment of public money and bad paid public servants. Social condition is other factor in which we can mention close group like religious, political, ethnic groups, and network of all friends. Population with low cultural level, analphabet, and without reflection about political choices is one of these type of groups that can affect the generation of corruption. And the social value of honesty and integrity of the context that we are in. And last but not least, legal deficit, that when we find it, like for example, weakness of the legal system and also corruption in the judicial system itself. A problem that is very related to corruption is conflict of interest. A conflict of interest occurs when an entity or individual becomes unreliable because of a clash between personal or self-serving interest and professional duties or responsibilities. Such a conflict occurs when a company or a person has a vested interest, such as money, status, knowledge, relationships, or corruption, or reputation, which puts into question whether their actions, judgment, or decision-making can be unbiased. Some examples of conflict of interest could be representing a family member in court, starting a business that competes with your full-time employer, advising a client to invest in a company owned by your spouse, or hiring an unqualified relative or friend. When such a situation arises, the party with the conflict of interest is usually asked to remove themselves, and it is often legally required of them. These are some recommendations to avoid conflict of interest. Do not participate in issues where you are affected. Inform always your superior about ambiguous situations. Make a public disclaimer if you need to, and also register the conflict of interest. Try to gather all the data that you can have in order to have proof or evidence about the conflict. Now let's talk about possible ways to prevent human rights violations and some solutions in case of such violations have been already committed. Since 2011, we have had a guide from the United Nations specifically designed for states and companies, the United Nations Guiding Principles, UNGP, on business on human rights. This guide has 3 pillars. Let's see. The state is the first one, must respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and fundamental freedoms. Second, companies must respect human rights and comply with the law. And both, this is the third pillar, both the state and companies have to facilitate access to remedies for the victims of violations that have already been committed. So, the state has an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and fundamental freedoms. To achieve this, it has at least 2 founding principles. The first one is that states must protect against human rights violations by preventing, investigating, punishing, and remedying these violations. And second, the state must clearly state that they expect companies to respect human rights and their activities. In addition, the guide tells us that states must follow at least 8 operating principles, which can be summarized in the following points. The state's one function, that is, they must enforce law that aim to make companies respect human rights. The nexus between state and business, they must adopt additional measures to protect against violations that have already been committed by companies. Promote respect for human rights by companies in conflict zones. In this sense, collaborate with the companies to determine, prevent, and mitigate the risk of their activities. And also, states must guarantee political coherence. That is, ensure that their own institutions comply with human rights. Companies, on the other side, have the responsibility to comply with all applicable laws and respect human rights. To do, companies have 5 founding principles from these human rights guidelines. First, they must respect human rights, that is, refrain from violating human rights and deal with the negative consequences. Second, companies must respect the internationally recognized human rights in the International Charter of Human Rights and the principles of the ILO Declaration. Third, companies must avoid and mitigate their practices from having negative consequences on human rights. 4. This applies to all companies, regardless of their size, sector, location, ownership, and structure. 5. Companies must have policies and procedures to respect human rights, like ethical codes, code of conduct, ethical guidelines, compliance system, and so on. In addition, companies have 9 operating principles, which can be summarized in the following points. Companies must have an explicit political commitment that is a specific declaration of human rights. Companies must have a due diligence process in which an assessment of the real impact is carried out. Violations are prevented, the consequences are monitored, and the measures taken to do so are publicly reported. They must seek reparation for all damages caused. They must also take into account the context in which they operate. For example, comply with the law, seek formulas that allow them to respect human rights, consider the risk of violation as matter of compliance with the law, and so on. In order to improve victims' access to effective remedies, both judicial and extrajudicial ways, states will therefore be primarily responsible. For the states, they have a founding principle. States must take measures to ensure victim access to effective remedies. That is, they must establish a state mechanism, as I said, judicial and extrajudicial, as well as non-state mechanism, also judicial and extrajudicial. And they must also establish criteria for the effectiveness of extrajudicial grievance mechanism. That is, criteria that they are legitimate, accessible, predictable, equitable, transparent, compatible with rights, that are a source of continuous learning based always on participation and dialogue. There are a database for companies to upload their reports on respecting human rights, and these are some of the companies that are participating by sharing their reports. These are some companies that are guided by the UNGP to respect human rights. Of course, these are only some examples. I mean, these companies are trying to respect human rights, and not in not all the cases they are doing it. So that's all for today. Next session, Felix will talk to you about other type of ethical problems, for example, discrimination and equity around employees. So, see you soon.